The sound of frantic knocks on his creaky front door shattered the silence of the night. Dylan, a struggling young man barely making ends meet, froze mid-step in his dimly lit living room. It was nearing midnight, and visitors weren't exactly common in his rundown neighborhood. Cautiously, he approached the door, his heart thudding in his chest. Pulling it open, he found a woman, soaked to the bone from the storm raging outside, clutching a shivering little boy in her arms. Her eyes, wide with fear and desperation, locked onto his. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "We need help." Dylan hesitated. The woman looked exhausted, her thin coat offering little protection against the elements. The boy clung to her, his tiny face pale and tear-streaked. Dylan's instinct screamed to close the door. Strangers meant trouble, and he had enough problems of his own. But something in her trembling plea stopped him. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. As they stumbled into the warmth of his modest home, the woman's guarded gratitude didn't go unnoticed. She introduced herself as Erin and her son as Jamie. She avoided his questions about why they were out in such terrible weather, brushing off his concerns with vague answers about needing to escape a bad situation. Dylan didn't press further, though curiosity gnawed at him. Instead, he offered them dry clothes and a place to sleep, deciding that whatever storm had driven them to his doorstep, it wasn't his business. But the next morning, things began to unravel. When Dylan woke up, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled his tiny apartment. Rubbing his eyes, he shuffled into the kitchen to find Erin at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. Jamie sat at the table, giggling as he tried to spoon-feed himself with little success. "Good morning," Erin said, her voice warm but still tinged with hesitation. "You didn't have to do that," Dylan mumbled, scratching the back of his neck. He wasn't used to anyone cooking in his space, let alone strangers. "It's the least I could do," Erin replied, glancing over her shoulder. "Thank you again for letting us stay. I didn't know where else to go." There it was again, the cryptic, incomplete explanation. Dylan didn't press, but as the day went on, he noticed little things that didn't add up. Erin's nervous glances out the window, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the bruises faintly visible on her wrist when her sleeve slipped up. It wasn't until that evening, after Jamie had fallen asleep on the couch, that Dylan found the courage to ask. "Erin, what's really going on?" he said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't just show up at a stranger's door in the middle of the night without a reason." Erin hesitated, her hands tightening around the mug she was holding. "It's complicated," she began, her voice trembling. "But the short version? I was married to someone dangerous, controlling. Jamie and we had to get out before it was too late." Dylan's chest tightened. He'd seen stories like this on the news, but never imagined he'd be face to face with someone living it. "Does he know where you are?" Dylan asked. "No," Erin said quickly, but the flicker of doubt in her eyes betrayed her. The next few days passed in a strange blur. Dylan found himself growing attached to Jamie, who followed him around like a shadow, and to Erin, whose quiet strength amazed him. But the peace was short-lived. One afternoon, as Dylan walked home from his part-time job, he spotted a black SUV parked down the street. It was the kind of car that didn't belong in his neighborhood, too sleek, too polished. A man in a suit leaned against it, scanning the area like a predator stalking its prey. Dylan's stomach churned. Something about the man set off alarm bells. When he got home, Erin was pacing the living room, her face pale. "What's wrong?" Dylan asked, already fearing the answer. "He's here," she whispered. From that moment, the tension became unbearable. Dylan fortified his apartment as best as he could, double-locking doors, keeping curtains drawn, but he knew it was only a matter of time. The man in the SUV wasn't just looking for Erin. He was hunting her. One night, the sound of glass shattering jolted Dylan awake. He sprang out of bed and raced to the living room, where Erin stood frozen, clutching Jamie tightly. A masked intruder loomed in the broken window, his eyes cold and calculating. "Hand them over, and no one gets hurt," the man growled. "Get out," Dylan shouted, grabbing a baseball bat he kept by the door. The man smirked, clearly unimpressed. You don't know what you're getting yourself into, kid. But Dylan didn't back down. The adrenaline coursing through him made him fearless, even as the intruder lunged at him. The fight was chaotic. Furniture toppled, and the apartment was thrown into disarray. But Dylan managed to land a solid hit, driving the man back out the window. As sirens wailed in the distance, the intruder disappeared into the night. The police arrived shortly after, but their involvement brought more questions than answers. Erin's full story came to light. Her ex-husband was a wealthy, influential man with a dark side he kept well hidden. She'd left him after discovering the extent of his crimes, taking Jamie to protect him. But her ex wasn't just after her out of spite. She held evidence that could ruin him. Dylan couldn't believe the depth of the danger he'd unwittingly stepped into. You can leave, Erin said the next day, her voice heavy with guilt. You've already done more than enough. I can't ask you to risk your life for us. But Dylan shook his head. You're not going anywhere. Not until this is over. With nowhere else to turn, they devised a plan to take Erin's evidence to the authorities. But as they set their plan into motion, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The plan seemed straightforward. Get Erin's evidence to someone in law enforcement who wasn't under her ex-husband's thumb. But nothing about their situation was simple. Dylan didn't fully trust the police. He'd seen enough corruption in his life to know better, but Erin had a contact she believed in. A detective named Morales who had once helped a close friend of hers escape a similar nightmare. Late that night, as Jamie slept curled up on the couch, Erin pulled out a small, battered USB drive from her purse. This is it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Bank records, emails, surveillance footage. All of it. Dylan stared at the drive. It was so small, yet it held enough weight to topple a man as powerful as her ex-husband. How do we know Morales can handle this? Dylan asked. He's the only one I trust, Erin replied, but even she sounded unsure. The next morning, Dylan borrowed a friend's old beater car, its engine sputtering like it might give out any second. He didn't want to risk being tracked, so they ditched their phones and stuck to back roads. The tension in the car was palpable, Erin constantly glancing over her shoulder while Jamie clutched his toy dinosaur tightly, sensing the unease in the air. As they neared the city, Dylan spotted a black SUV in the rearview mirror. His stomach dropped. We've got company, he said, his voice tight. Erin twisted in her seat, her face paling as she recognized the vehicle. It's him. Dylan's grip on the wheel tightened. Hold on. He slammed his foot on the gas, the old car groaning in protest. The SUV roared behind them, its driver clearly unbothered by the traffic laws Dylan was desperately trying to navigate. The chase was a blur of screeching tires and near misses. Dylan swerved onto a side street, narrowly avoiding a collision, but the SUV was relentless. Jamie started crying, and Erin did her best to calm him, though her own fear was palpable. Take the next right, Erin shouted, spotting an alleyway ahead. Dylan obeyed, the car skidding as he turned. The alley was narrow, littered with trash, but it was their only chance. The SUV couldn't follow them here. For a moment, it seemed like they'd lost him. The street ahead opened up, and Dylan drove until they reached a small parking garage. He pulled into a shadowy corner and killed the engine, the silence almost deafening. Is everyone okay? Dylan asked, his voice shaky. Jamie sniffled but nodded, while Erin just squeezed Dylan's arm. They made it to Morales's safe house an hour later. The detective was an imposing man with a no-nonsense demeanor, but his eyes softened when he saw Erin and Jamie. You did the right thing coming to me, he said, taking the USB drive from Erin. But this isn't over. If your ex knows you have this, he'll stop at nothing to get it back. We figured that out, Dylan muttered, his mind replaying the chase. Morales promised to keep them safe while he worked to expose Erin's ex. For a few days, they stayed holed up in the safe house, tension thick in the air. But the calm didn't last. One night, Morales's phone buzzed. He read the message and cursed under his breath. They found us. The safe house was supposed to be impenetrable, but Erin's ex had resources Dylan couldn't even fathom. Within minutes, The quiet neighborhood was swarming with black SUVs. "We need to move," Morales barked, grabbing his gun. Dylan helped Aaron and Jamie out the back, adrenaline surging as he heard footsteps closing in. They made it to a second car Morales had stashed nearby, and Dylan took the wheel again. The chase was even more chaotic this time, bullets pinging off the car as they tore through the city. Morales returned fire from the passenger seat, his aim sharp, but the SUVs kept coming. "Where are we going?" Dylan shouted over the chaos. "To the station," Morales replied. "If we can get this drive into the system, his people won't be able to cover it up." They barely made it. The car skidded to a halt in front of the police station, smoke billowing from the engine. Morales ushered them inside, shouting orders to his colleagues. For hours, Aaron and Dylan sat in a small office while Morales worked. The station buzzed with activity, officers scrambling to handle the fallout of Aaron's revelations. Finally, Morales returned, his face grim but triumphant. "We've got him," he said. "The evidence is secure, and a warrant is out for his arrest." Aaron burst into tears, the weight of years of fear and uncertainty finally lifting. In the weeks that followed, Aaron's ex was arrested, his empire crumbling under the weight of his crimes. Dylan helped Aaron and Jamie start a new life, far away from the city where their nightmare had begun. It wasn't easy, but for the first time in years they felt safe. And for Dylan, who had spent so much of his life feeling lost and powerless, he found something he never expected: a purpose. The next few weeks after Aaron's ex-husband's arrest were supposed to be a reprieve, but life didn't ease up as much as Dylan had hoped. Aaron and Jamie stayed at a motel on the edge of town while Morales and the authorities tried to wrap up the loose ends of the case. Dylan stayed nearby, unable to abandon the people who had turned his life upside down, and, in a strange way, given it meaning. But Dylan's newfound sense of purpose wasn't without its challenges. His landlord wasn't thrilled about the damage to his apartment from the earlier break-in, and the repairs would cost more than Dylan could afford. Morales had promised compensation once the case resolved, but for now, Dylan had to pick up more shifts at his low-paying maintenance job just to stay afloat. One evening, after a grueling 12-hour day, Dylan stopped by the motel to check on Aaron and Jamie. As he approached the room, he could hear Jamie's laughter from inside. For a moment, it made him smile. He hadn't heard the boy laugh like that in weeks. When Aaron opened the door, she looked less tense than usual, though the dark circles under her eyes hadn't disappeared. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "We were just finishing dinner." Dylan entered the small room, his heart warming at the sight of Jamie playing with a set of toy cars on the floor. "How was work?" Aaron asked as she handed Dylan a cup of coffee. "Long," he replied, sinking into the chair by the window. "But I'm managing." Aaron sat across from him, her hands wrapped around her own mug. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was comfortable, but Dylan couldn't ignore the lingering tension in Aaron's posture. "They're not giving you trouble here, are they?" he asked. "No," Aaron said quickly, though her eyes flicked toward the window. "But I can't help feeling like it's not over, like he's still out there, waiting for the right moment." Dylan's jaw tightened. "He's in custody." Morales said they're building an airtight case against him. "I know," Aaron said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But men like him, they always have people. Loyal ones. Ones who'll do anything for the right price." The next day, Dylan's suspicions that Aaron's fears weren't unfounded were confirmed. As he left work, he noticed a man lingering near his building. A man who didn't fit in with the usual crowd of weary tenants and tired workers. The stranger was dressed too neatly, his gaze sharp as he pretended to check his phone. Dylan ducked around the corner and watched. The man seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. His heart pounded as he realized the man wasn't there by coincidence. Dylan quickly left through a back exit, taking a longer route to the motel. When he arrived, he found Aaron pacing the room, her phone in hand. She looked up as he entered, her face pale. "What's wrong?" Dylan asked, setting his bag down. "Morales called," Aaron said, her voice trembling. "The evidence we gave him, it's being challenged in court. He thinks someone's trying to get the case thrown out." Dylan felt his stomach sink. What does that mean? It means he could walk, Erin said, her eyes filling with tears. And if that happens, Dylan didn't need her to finish the sentence. That night, Dylan stayed at the motel with Erin and Jamie, too uneasy to leave them alone. As they tried to sleep, Dylan lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the building. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Around 3 a.m., his instincts proved correct. A faint scraping noise came from the door. Dylan bolted upright, his heart racing. "Stay with Jamie," he whispered to Erin as he grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a lamp from the nightstand. The door handle jiggled, and then the lock clicked. Dylan held his breath, his grip tightening on the lamp. The door creaked open, and a figure slipped inside, their movements deliberate and silent. Without thinking, Dylan swung the lamp, catching the intruder off guard. The man grunted in pain but quickly recovered, lunging at Dylan with a knife. They grappled in the dim light, the fight chaotic and brutal. Erin screamed, waking Jamie, who started crying. The noise seemed to throw the intruder off, giving Dylan the opening he needed to land a solid punch. The man stumbled back, and Dylan didn't hesitate. He grabbed Jamie and Erin and bolted out the door, not stopping until they reached the motel office. The police arrived minutes later, but by then, the intruder was gone. The attack only confirmed what Dylan and Erin had feared. Her ex-husband's reach extended far beyond a jail cell. Morales arranged for them to be moved to a safe house in another state, but the journey there was anything but smooth. The constant threat of being followed or ambushed kept them on edge, and every stranger they passed felt like a potential enemy. Dylan could see the toll it was taking on Erin. Her once strong resolve was beginning to crack, and Jamie's usual cheerfulness was replaced by a quiet, wary demeanor. But Dylan refused to give up. He promised himself he would see them through this no matter what it took. The drive to the new safe house was grueling. Dylan, Erin, and Jamie crammed into another borrowed car. This one an aging sedan with a shaky steering wheel and an air conditioner that wheezed more than it cooled. Morales had arranged for a series of checkpoints where trusted contacts would guide them, but each stop was fraught with unease. As Dylan drove, the miles stretching endlessly ahead, Jamie dozed off in the back seat. Erin sat rigid in the passenger seat, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. "You should rest," Dylan said gently. "I can't," Erin whispered, her voice tight. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him, or his men. They're always there, waiting to take Jamie." Dylan gripped the wheel tighter. "They won't. Not while I'm here." Erin turned to him, her expression softening. "Why are you doing this, Dylan? You could have walked away, should have walked away. But you didn't." "Why?" Dylan hesitated. He didn't have a neat answer. I know what it's like to feel powerless," he said finally. "To feel like the whole world's against you. I don't want Jamie to grow up feeling that way." Erin reached out and placed her hand over his. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Their next checkpoint was a secluded diner off a deserted highway. The contact, a woman named Susan, was waiting for them in a corner booth, her hair tucked under a baseball cap. She gave them a quick nod as they slid into the seats across from her. "I've got your next steps mapped out," Susan said, sliding a folded map across the table. "But you need to move fast. There's chatter that they're closing in." Erin paled. "How close?" "Close enough," Susan said grimly. "I suggest you don't stick around here long." As they left the diner, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The parking lot was empty except for a rusty truck and a lone sedan. But something felt off. "Get in the car," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What is it?" Erin asked, her eyes darting around. "Just get in," Dylan insisted. The moment they were back in the car, Dylan started the engine and pulled onto the road. In the rearview mirror, the lone sedan rumbled to life, its headlights snapping on. "They're following us," Dylan muttered. The pursuit quickly escalated. Dylan pushed the old sedan to its limits, the engine roaring as he sped down the empty highway. The pursuing car kept pace, its driver clearly skilled. "Jamie, keep your head down," Dylan shouted as the first bullet shattered the back window. Erin screamed, pulling Jamie into her arms and shielding him with her body. Dylan swerved, narrowly avoiding another volley of gunfire. Up ahead, the highway forked, one path leading to a wooded area. Without hesitation, Dylan veered onto the forest road, hoping the rough terrain would slow their pursuers. The car jolted violently as it hit the uneven dirt path, but the pursuing vehicle stayed close, its headlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. Dylan spotted a narrow trail veering off to the left and took it, the trees closing in around them like a tunnel. Finally, the sound of the pursuing car faded, swallowed by the dense forest. Dylan brought the car to a screeching halt and killed the engine, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, turning to look at Aaron and Jamie. "We're fine," Aaron said, though her voice shook. Jamie nodded, his eyes wide with fear but otherwise unharmed. "We need to keep moving," Aaron said. "They'll be back." The safe house was less of a house and more of a dilapidated cabin deep in the woods. Morales had warned them it wasn't much, but it was secure. Dylan wasn't convinced. It looked like a stiff breeze could knock it over, but it would have to do. Inside, Dylan barricaded the doors and windows as best as he could while Aaron tried to comfort Jamie. The tension was suffocating, every creak of the old cabin setting them on edge. Hours turned into days, the isolation gnawing at their nerves. Morales occasionally checked in through a secure line, assuring them that progress was being made, but it wasn't enough to dispel their fear. And then, one night, the inevitable happened. Dylan was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside. He grabbed the hunting rifle Morales had left with them and moved to the window, peering into the darkness. Shadows shifted between the trees, and then a flashlight beam swept across the cabin. "They're here," Dylan whispered, his voice shaking. Aaron clutched Jamie tightly, her eyes wide with terror. "Stay in the bedroom," Dylan instructed. "Don't come out until I say it's safe." Aaron nodded, disappearing into the back room with Jamie. Dylan positioned himself by the front door, the rifle trembling in his hands. The footsteps grew louder, and then the door rattled as someone tried to force it open. "Get out of here," Dylan shouted, his voice cracking. The response was a gunshot, the bullet splintering the wooden door. Dylan fired back, the recoil nearly knocking him off his feet. The attackers scattered, shouting orders to each other. The next few minutes were a blur of chaos. Dylan moved from window to window, firing at shadows and dodging bullets that shattered the cabin's fragile walls. The attackers were relentless, but Dylan's desperation gave him an edge. Finally, a distant shout rang out, Morales's voice. "Drop your weapons. Hands in the air." The attackers hesitated, and then the sound of police sirens filled the air. When the dust settled, Morales explained that they had intercepted communications about the attack and arrived just in time. Aaron's ex-husband's network was dismantled, and he was now facing additional charges for orchestrating the assault. For the first time in weeks, Dylan, Aaron, and Jamie could breathe freely. In the months that followed, Aaron and Jamie started rebuilding their lives, this time without the shadow of fear hanging over them. Dylan stayed in touch, helping them settle into a new home and even finding a better job for himself in the process. Aaron never stopped thanking him, but Dylan always brushed it off. "I just did what anyone would do," he said. But Aaron knew better. Not everyone would have risked everything for strangers. Dylan had proven that even in the darkest of times, kindness and courage could change lives, and maybe even save them.